Hello everyone. Today I will be featuring the Worcester. I have no idea if that's correctly pronounced. I don't really care. I'm just gonna call it the Worcester, which is the upcoming Tier 10 American light cruiser. The line is splitting up is it Tier 6 to light cruisers and heavy cruisers. The Des Moines is of course the Tier 10 heavy cruiser. This is going to be the Tier 10 light cruiser. I'm going to be comparing this ship heavily to the Des Moines because the playstyle is quite similar. I'm also going to be comparing it a fair bit to the Minotaur because once again very similar playstyles, and people should be quite familiar with both of those ships. Now, first thing worth noticing is 45.4k health. That is not particularly impressive. That means the Des Moines has about 10% more health, a bit more actually, and add in the fact that Des Moines also has significantly better armor, especially, well, pretty much everywhere. It has a better belt, but more importantly the bow and the stern and even the upper belt on the Des Moines is 27 millimeters, whereas on the Worcester it's 25. Even the deck armor on the Worcester is 25 millimeters, which means the Des Moines has 30, which means that overmatch is pretty much going to be a daily thing in this ship. Even against Tier 8 battleships, Bismarcks, Richelieus, Torpedoes, all of these, even they will be able to overmatch pretty much every single part of your ship. So this ship is even more constrained to avoiding damage. I think that was Minotaur AP, huge chunk anyway. But ultimately this means that this ship is even more constrained to island cover than the Des Moines is. It of course doesn't have any smoke of its own, so it can't really position itself the same way, for example, the Minotaur can. So once again, this ship is incredibly matchmaking dependent, meaning you hope you don't get rough opponents, and you hope you get a map that provides you with enough island cover to use. Now, another thing worth mentioning is that the turret face on the Worcester is only 127 millimeters. Even the Des Moines has 203 millimeter armor, and even the Des Moines loses its turrets quite often if it gets hit in them. So obviously that gives you an idea of how easy it is to actually knock out these turrets on the ship. The Des Moines Citadel does extend slightly higher above the waterline, but ultimately both ships are fairly easy to citadel if they give you a broadside. And what's a bit weird is that the Worcester actually has the better torpedo belt. It has a 19% torpedo belt. Considering Des Moines has 7%, that's a pretty significant difference, which is weird considering the Worcester is the light cruiser, whereas Des Moines is the heavy cruiser, so that's a bit confusing to me that this ship has a significantly better torpedo belt. Size-wise, they are pretty similar. The Des Moines is slightly larger, both in length and in width, but the differences are quite small. The size is reflected in concealment, however. The Worcester gets a pretty damn insane 9.5 kilometer sea detection and 7.2 km air detection. I'll return to that air detection thing in a bit, but having that 9.5 km concealment is pretty damn insane. That's more than a kilometer better than the Des Moines has. Des Moines gets 10.6. Combine that with the standard American radar that has 9.9 km range, the Worcester can easily push into radar range while being undetected. So that means it's obviously a huge threat to any concealment or smoke-based ship like any DDs or Royal Navy cruisers and such things. Getting close is pretty damn easy in this ship because you're undetected, but getting out of those situations has proved to be surprisingly difficult because, well, once again, you have no smoke, so if you commit to any situation, you need to get into cover, but getting into cover has proved to be quite difficult. It does have a 740 meter turning circle and an 8.6 second rudder shift, so you'd expect the ship to handle fairly well. Now, it's not Minotaur level 660 meter turning circle, but I've been surprised by how sluggish the ship has felt. I'm not entirely certain what the reasoning is for it. I wonder if it's perhaps because the acceleration is so much slower than the Minotaur acceleration, or perhaps the ship loses more speed in turns. I'm not entirely sure. Someone can get in on that and like see what it is, but ultimately, if you expect to pull off the kind of maneuvers that you can with the Minotaur, if you try to pull off the same things in this ship, you're going to be very disappointed, because it clearly doesn't handle quite as well. The firepower, though, which you have been seeing me ducka-duckaing here for quite a fair bit, the firepower is consistent if you use the HE. The power can be debated, though. You have 6 turrets, 2 guns each, 125mm guns, which means pretty much IFHE is mandatory. You can't play tier 10 with 152s and not run IFHE, so IFHE is practically a must-have on this ship. If you run the reload mode, as I do, you get a pretty damn juicy 4-second reload, which means, of course, you're practically a tier 10 Atlanta. Now, you do steadily deal a very consistent amount of damage, especially against DDs. The shell velocity, though, is garbage. As you can already see, this guy is 10 km away, and you can already see just the kind of arcs we're dealing with here. It's 8.5 seconds to travel to target at 10 kilometers. So this is naturally a pretty damn big deal, and these shells are very light and there's a lot of air drag, so the further away you have to shoot, the harder it becomes to get any sort of hit. So it's very Atlanta-esque in this way. So your effective range, even though your default range is 16.7 km, it's unlikely you're actually going to be shooting too many targets at 16.7. At any sort of long range, your only targets are really battleships and stationary or straight-lining cruisers. Any sort of maneuvers from the cruisers, or even maneuvers from the battleships, enable them to evade your shells quite easily. So trying to get any sort of consistent long-range damage is pretty impossible. Trying to hit DDs at pretty much 12 kilometers or further away is practically impossible. I mean, this is 11.4 and we're dealing with almost 9 seconds of shell travel time. So you try to hit a DD that's actively avoiding with a 9-second shell travel time. Yeah, you have a lot of shells in the air, sure, but the consistency, once again, it really isn't there. The AP actually has slightly better crop than the rest of the American light AP shells, but even then it's 152mm AP. It's not that super heavy Des Moines AP. Quite often I find myself trying out the AP on broadsides and then I switch back to HE, because that IFHE HE is so much more consistent. Ultimately, the ship kind of struggles in any sort of situations where it's forced to use that AP. That is close ranges, or well, in general, fighting any other cruisers. The ship really isn't that good. It's really strong at mid-ranges, especially if you get to use island cover, because you can easily lob shells over the islands where the rest of the cruisers pretty much just hit the islands. The issue is that at long ranges, they pretty much annihilate you. It's kind of like the Atlanta being forced to fight in the open. At long ranges, they just kite you, gun you down, and you can't really do much. You struggle to hit them, whereas they're melting you. You have no armor against AP or HE, so you just get completely melted. At close ranges, it's actually possibly even worse. The Worcester is really bad at brawling. If you go nose in the ship, you can actually only use 2 of your 6 turrets. Because the third turret gets blocked by the front turret, or the second turret gets blocked by the front turret, so you can only use your number 1 and number 3 turrets. And that really limits your firepower so heavily, whereas pretty much everyone else who goes nose in can either bring half their firepower, or in the case of ships like Des Moines and Moskva, they can bring 66% of their firepower to bear. But you're only bringing, what, 33% of your firepower to bear if you try to go nose in. So any sort of situation where you're forced to brawl at close range, you struggle. Oh my lord, you struggle so heavily. And if you try to bring more guns to bear, you expose that really weak citadel. You don't have any sort of torpedo armament, so any ship that gets close enough to torp you are in huge trouble. Especially even if they get broadside to torp you, it's still gonna take you a while to melt through them, even with that AP power. And if you just sit nose in and reverse, Well, I did mention the turret faces were 127 millimeters, which means AP will quite easily knock out those turrets. So, huge issues in any sort of brawling. Now, the turret traverse is excellent. 8.3 second turret traverse, even with the 3 million reload module that slows down the turret traverse. But even with that advantage, close range brawls in this ship are very hard. I mean, of course, if someone messes up and gives you full broadside and you can just bring all this firepower to bear, of course, then you can easily, like, brawl and kill. But against people who have any idea what they're doing, people who just go nose in, you're just gonna get completely annihilated. Like, Des Moines nose in against Worcester nose in, the Des Moines just eats you alive. It's not even close. Another thing that I mentioned there was the lack of torpedoes, and that's actually a pretty damn huge deal. People often underestimate the power of, for example, Minotaur torps, but they serve as a huge deterrent against anyone trying to just rush down the Minotaur. Especially battleships. Battleships are afraid to rush down a Minotaur because they know there's a potential of this huge swarm of torps wrecking them. The Worcester doesn't have any such safety net. A battleship can literally just sail across the map, bum rush you and kill you, and there is absolutely nothing you can do about it. The only thing that can save you is running away or getting support from your team. And that complete lack of torpedo armament really is a huge deal, and it makes it so extremely vulnerable to any sort of battleship that just basically goes for it. If a battleship goes, well, I'm fed up with this guy, I'm gonna rush him. Like, even the Atlanta has torpedoes to protect itself. Worcester has no such thing, so very vulnerable in that sense. The AA on this ship is amazing, borderline ridiculous. If you slot the AA range module and you spec AFT, both of which I recommend, you get 8.6 km range on your longest range aura, and your AA values are extremely good. And yeah, I should be able to, like, these arcs, this is 14 kilometers away. This is 14 kilometers away. I'm shooting a tier 10 battleship. So obviously this so-called range of 16.7 is very much within quotation marks. Anyway, back to the AA. It's extremely potent. Almost all the big Dakka is on the long-range guns, and if you combine that with the fact that this ship has an air detection value of 7.2, as I mentioned earlier, you realize you can easily turn off your AA, lure the planes into like 7 km range, then turn on the AA again and just snipe a bunch of the planes down. As soon as this Moskva starts accelerating, it becomes so much harder to land any shells on him. Once again, the DPM is fairly occasionally consistent, but hitting any sort of ship, fighting other cruisers in general in this ship, not that fun. But I made a stream highlight on the power of the anti-air. I made a stream highlight, I can link it in the comment below so you guys can see. I spec'd fully into AA in that one, but it does give you some idea of how ridiculous it is. Now, also worth mentioning is that the ship has a rather unique ability to slot both Hydro and defensive AA, and this is actually really nice. Now, American Hydro tier 10 isn't really that special. It has 4.9 km ship spotting range. Not really much to brag about, but having both Hydro and defensive AA ready, regardless of what matchmaking you end up with, do you face a carrier, do you face a bunch of DDs, it's really nice. It's nice to always be prepared, so to say. Now, oh, and worth mentioning, smoke firing is really good in this ship. You got a 6 km smoke firing penalty, which means if a DD smokes you up, or you can sneak into a smoke with another Royal Navy cruiser, you are really powerful. So in divisions, for example, carrier plus DD plus Worcester, you are stupidly strong, because, well, it allows your AA power to shine, and the smoke covers all the weaknesses, which is, of course, lack of armor and the fact that you can get flanked. So this ship, it's quite strong, but it's so map reliant. It's so much more map reliant than even the Des Moines, and the Des Moines is a very map reliant cruiser. The Des Moines especially is very strong close range. This ship, not that much. Okay, we catch a Minotaur off guard, and we rain down AP, we get citadels, we get citadels, we get citadels, and he angles, and we stop getting citadels. Our citadel is over. And now we have to angle in, because you see his AP is penetrating. His AP is penetrating heavily at that angle. So I have to go full nose in, and now my DPM pretty much plummets. Because now I can only bring 2 guns to bear. And there goes all my DPM. And yes, I started this fight much lower HP, but I caught him full broadside, and ultimately I know I'm trying to hit his torpedoes because I already know what he's going to do. He's going to turn full broadside and he's going to torp me. I switch to AP as soon as he starts turning. I do Citadel and kill him, but at this point, I can't eat a single torpedo, and I'm too fat to fit between the torps, so I'm trying to evade out of them, but it's too late at this point, and I do end up going down. Note that I'm shooting AP at this broadside Moskva, and the shells are shattering on his belt, because once again, the AP performance isn't really that special. Ultimately though, killing the Minotaur left my Moskva, who was almost full HP, against their Moskva that has almost no health, so it was a very easy win in the end. 208k damage, that's always nice. Ultimately I only managed to get 1 kill, but this game showed, I think, some very important things. First of all, how much firepower you can bring to bear from cover, and also how much you struggle if you're forced to brawl in this ship. How heavily you struggle. Yes, I did trade with a Minotaur who was practically full health, and I had almost no health, but I also caught him full broadside. I caught him full broadside, and I landed 9 citadels on him, and he still torped and killed me. So, close range, this ship doesn't have a good time. Long range, this ship doesn't have a good time. Medium range, and if you can have access to cover, either in the form of smokes or islands, this ship is very, very strong. So, extremely situational. Extremely situational. Very map reliant and very situational. Looking at team score, we actually got 2.7k base. All my kills went to everyone else because, well, you don't really have that alpha to secure the kills. You kind of melt them steadily and hope that you manage to get the kill. Doesn't really matter too much. I mean, it is a test ship. It's still a work in progress. Detailed report wise, 1.3 million potential, which is always okay. Shells fired 1,350 or something, because I shot AP as well. Fires, not really that impressive fire damage. Ultimately, the majority of your damage will no doubt come from that HE spam, just raining down HE on them. I did 53k damage to that Minotaur. His super heal though kept him easily alive. Of course, you don't have access to any such thing. And the brawl really showed two of the things that helps the Minotaur so much. The ability to torp your target, which gives it close range threat, and if you get caught by surprise, that's super heal. The Worcester, of course, lacks both of those safety nets, so to say. So, balance-wise, I'm not entirely certain. I can accept the fact that you're really, really bad at long range. But it kind of bothers me that you're so bad at close range as well. I'm wondering if you could if this ship could possibly be given torpedoes. I know some people are going to be, but in real life or something similar. But for the sake of balance, the fact that it has no close range threat is kind of sad. It's like in a 1 versus 1, I don't really see any cruiser that would straight up lose to it. Most cruisers can probably trade with it quite easily, in fact. Zhao maybe, that's one of the worst brawlers, but even why would Zhao push into brawl when Zhao can just kite away and melt it? So yeah, I don't want them to give it smoke, because that would make it too face roll. The Minotaur is already pretty face roll in that sense, because smoke removes the need for any sort of intelligent positioning. You just go anywhere and you plop down a smoke, and tada! As long as you have some island close to you, you can sail behind. If you get radared, you're pretty fine. And so smoke would be the boring solution, but giving it some sort of close range threat would, in my opinion, be a really good idea, because right now, if a battleship sees you and your team doesn't shoot down that battleship, the battleship can literally just hold down W and just rush you and kill you, and you can't do anything about it. You have no counter threat. Pretty much everyone else has some sort of counter threat there besides you, so that is a bit sad. I mean, even Des Moines, if you get broadside to Des Moines, that AP damage will just melt you so quickly. I don't know. It feels like it's a happy meal to any battleship that gets close, and that's a bit too extreme in the vulnerability. Right now I feel it's too situational. I'm okay with situational cruisers, but being this situational is a bit absurd. And it will get reflected in your damage scores. If you get good maps that favor you, you will have these really good games where you break 200k. But yeah, then when it goes the other way, I ended up having Ocean played yesterday, and I was pretty much just jumping from DD smoke to DD smoke. Trying to fight in the open is simply not an option, so very reliant on both teammates and matchmaking. Anyway, let me show you guys my recommended build for this ship. Right, let me start by showing my build. Module wise, well, there's not much to talk about. I run the premium consumables, which you of course can switch to from doubloons to credit cost just by pressing the small arrow. Upgrade wise, turret survival, because as I mentioned, they are very squishy. Here I would recommend radar duration module. I'm running the defensive AA one because simply I couldn't be arsed moving it from one of my other ships. AA range, because well, that's kind of your bread and butter. Faster rudder shift, better concealment, better reload. And the main battery traverse speed nerf doesn't really have any impact on the ship, so it's practically a free reloading bonus. Captain perks wise, priority target, you need to know who's shooting you. AR, you don't really need any of the other perks here. Superintendent, you have so many consumables, it would be a waste to not get this. Concealment, IFHE, because well, you have 152mm guns, which benefit heavily from IFHE. And finally, of course, AFT to boost that AA range to that pretty incredible 8.6 km range. In fact, if you guys want to see the values, 133 on the 8.6 km range, and then we have these two auras, 338 and 43, and these are both 7.2. So pretty much all the AA is on the long range. So obviously the results are absolutely ridiculous. And oh yeah, let me show you the armor. Well, first of all, let's start with the armor. You can see the squishiness, 25, 25, 25. Everything is 25, and of course the turret face is 127. So of course if you try to go nose in and you get AP here, well, you get kind of wrecked. There's also of course the fact that this turret here blocks this turret from firing entirely. So you can actually only use the third turret and the first one if you angle. You have to give a fair amount of broadside to be able to use this middle turret, and well, it depends on the situation, but it can be quite hard to make use of it, especially in brawling situations, because once again we do have a quite vulnerable citadel. Let me get rid of the superstructure. The citadel is covered by 127mm armor as well, and it is, I mean, it extends a fair chunk out of the water. It's not as bad as the Des Moines, as I mentioned, but it's not very good at all. Well, it's clearly vulnerable, especially in the close range brawls. You won't have too many issues hitting the citadel in close range brawls. So a pretty clear weakness in that sense. Ultimately though, the ship is strong if the situation favors it. But if you end up getting like nasty matchmaking, or you get a bad map for it, you get some open map and you can't really get into a position to use cover and you're forced to fight in the open, it's nasty. It's like, it's even worse than the Des Moines, because the Des Moines, at least when you go nose in, you have this huge AP and you have this huge threat of firepower. But the Worcester, as soon as you're forced to angle, you lose so much firepower and you don't have any armor to bounce anything with, so you end up in this awkward situation where you're not really a threat, but you're not really a tank either. So you're kind of just an XP Pinata. The Worcester needs its island friend to hump. It needs its island friend, or it needs a smoke. If you don't have either, then you're in for a really rough time. Unless of course you're fighting DDs at close range, in which case you pretty much melt them. But so do pretty much all the other cruisers as well, with very few exceptions. Anyway, that was my Worcester review. I don't know. I played a fair amount of games in this ship. I like it, but you need to go into the ship with the... You need to be prepared for the fact that your games will vary greatly. You will have 200k games, and you will have 80k, maybe even less damage games. If your team collapses on one flank and you can't help, like if you get flanked, you're just in huge trouble. You can't kite around in the open like Hindenburg, Zhao, Henry, pretty much all of this, like Stalingrad. You can't move in the open and ducka ducka. As soon as you start trying to ducka ducka in the open, anyone who shoots you will blap you. And Battleship just needs to hit anywhere on your ship and he will overmatch you and he will penetrate and he will do massive damage. And you don't have that Minotaur super heal, so you're in for a rough time, especially with the health pool of only 45k health. Anyway, I will talk to you guys later. I hope you guys